This is my true story. I spent my life for my daughter, hoping she would care for me in my old age. But one afternoon, she slapped me in front of neighbors. I never expected such cruelty from my own child. My heart broke in silence, but my pride burned brighter. I decided I would not beg for respect. I would act. I chose revenge without noise, without anger. What I did next changed everything. Before I share the details, tell me where you are watching from right now, and please subscribe so my story reaches more people. I spent my whole life working hard to give my daughter comfort and security. From the day she was born, I told myself that I would make her life better than mine. I started work early every morning, before the sun rose, and came home late at night when the world was asleep. My hands grew rough and calloused from labor, but I never complained. Every brick I laid, every nail I hammered, every penny I saved, it was all for her. I wanted her to grow up without fear, without hunger, without need. I believed that the sacrifices I made were part of my duty as a father, and I never doubted that she would understand and appreciate them. I remember her childhood. She was a bright little girl who loved to laugh, and I loved to hear her laughter. I worked overtime so she could have school books, new shoes, and warm clothes in winter. I sold my own comfort for her comfort. There were years I ate only bread and water so she could have meat and milk. I wanted her to never know the struggle that I had endured. I believed that my hard work would build not just a house for her, but a life of safety, love, and honor. The house I built was not just wood and brick. It was my promise to her. Every corner, every room was a testament to my years of sweat. I painted the walls myself, fixed the roof myself, and made sure that everything was perfect. I wanted her to feel safe when she stepped inside. I told myself that this was my gift to her, a place where she would always belong. I thought that a house built with love and labor would carry a meaning beyond ownership, something she would carry in her heart forever. As years passed, I gave more than just labor. I gave my time. I was there for her when she needed advice, even when she thought she didn't. I was there when she cried, when she fell sick, when she faced troubles. I gave her the comfort of my presence, even when I was tired or had my own worries. I believed that being a father was more than just providing food and shelter. It was showing love, offering protection, and giving strength. I thought that all these years of devotion would build a bond that nothing could break. But somewhere along the way, I began to notice a change. I noticed her voice becoming sharper, her eyes losing warmth when she looked at me, her words carrying impatience instead of kindness. I heard her speaking of me quietly to others, saying I was old and weak, that I was holding her back. I thought perhaps it was the stress of life or the changes that come with time. I told myself patience would heal this coldness, that my years of devotion would not be forgotten. I clung to the hope that love and sacrifice could outlive pride and anger. I gave her my life without asking for anything in return, believing that respect and gratitude would be her natural answer. I never demanded, never asked for payment. My daughter was my joy, and her happiness was enough. I thought that in time, she would see the depth of what I gave her. I thought she would understand that what I built was not just a home, but a life filled with care, protection, and sacrifice. I believed that respect was the foundation of family life, and I believed she would always honor that foundation. Little did I know that respect was slipping away. I believed she would always treat me with kindness because of what we had shared, because of the years I had given her. But respect cannot live without nurture, and I had failed to notice that the words, the kindness, and the care had been replaced with impatience and disregard. I still believed in my heart that she would understand, that she would remember the sacrifices I made. I thought our bond was stronger than anything else. I was wrong. The day she slapped me in front of our neighbors was the day I realized my belief in that bond was gone. It was the day I understood that respect could not be assumed and that love could be mistaken for weakness. I had given everything without a thought of what I might receive, trusting that she would treat me with dignity. But that day, the truth struck me. My devotion had been taken for granted, and my love had been met with cruelty. I sat there in shock, my hand still trembling where hers had struck me. My heart ached more than my face, because I realized that I had not only lost respect, I had lost my place in her life. The house I had built, the years I had given, the sacrifices I had made, they seemed to mean nothing in that moment. I understood then that devotion alone could not protect against betrayal. I had given her the world, but she had chosen to give me humiliation. That moment stayed with me for days. I replayed it in my mind, over and over. I remembered every night I worked late to save money, every time I gave up sleep so she could have comfort, every sacrifice I made so she could live without struggle. And now, all of it felt forgotten. The warmth in her eyes was gone, replaced by impatience and disdain. I felt the truth settle in me like a stone. My devotion had been mistaken for weakness, and my kindness had been mistaken for a right she could take without care. I sat quietly that night in my own room, thinking about everything I had given. I thought about the years of labor, the countless sacrifices, and the love I had poured into her life. I thought about the respect I had hoped for and the way it had been stripped away in a single moment. My heart felt heavy, but beneath the weight there was a quiet decision forming. I knew I could not go on as if nothing had happened. I knew that silence would no longer answer her cruelty. That night, I made a vow to myself. I would not let her slap go unanswered, not with anger, not with shouting, but with action. I would find a way to make her understand the value of what she had lost, not through words, but through something far stronger. I knew it would not be easy, but I also knew it was necessary. I had given her life, and now it was time to reclaim my dignity. I began to think about what I could do, quietly and without haste. I thought about the house I had built, about the years of labor it represented, and about the rights I still held. I knew there were legal ways to act, ways that would speak louder than any argument. I began to see a path forward, one that would allow me to take back the respect that had been taken from me. I decided to prepare quietly, to let my actions speak for themselves, and to plan a lesson that would last. That decision was not born of anger alone, but of years of devotion turned to hurt. It was born of the realization that respect must be earned, not taken for granted. I knew I could not force her to change her heart, but I could show her the consequence of forgetting what she had been given. I knew that my action would not just be for me, but for the memory of every sacrifice I had made as a father. From that night onward, I began to plan in silence. I contacted my lawyer quietly, without announcing my intent. I reviewed the documents and discovered the legal rights I held over her property. I learned that I had the power to act, and I knew that I must. I began to see the act of selling her house as not just revenge, but as the reclaiming of my dignity and the answer to the cruelty I had endured. I spent days in thought, considering every possibility. I thought about the cost, the impact, the message it would send. But I knew there was no turning back. The years of devotion had led me to this moment, and I was prepared to see it through. I decided to act quietly, without confrontation, letting the action itself speak the words that she had refused to hear. I wanted her to understand that what she had taken for granted was more than just walls and furniture. It was a lifetime of care, a father's sacrifice, and a bond that could be broken. I knew that no argument, no pleading could undo the humiliation I felt that day, but I could show her, in a way she would never forget, what happens when love is met with betrayal. That was the moment my resolve hardened. I decided I would sell her house, not with rage, but with quiet determination, not with noise, but with the certainty that my years of devotion had value beyond her disrespect. I knew this would be my answer, my way of reclaiming what had been lost, and I would do it without a word of drama, letting the truth speak for itself. And so began the journey that would change both our lives forever. The first signs of disrespect did not come in a single moment, but like slow drops of water wearing away stone. They began quietly, almost unnoticed. At first, it was a change in her tone when she spoke to me. Where once her voice carried warmth and respect, there was now a hardness I could not ignore. I heard impatience in her words when she answered me. It was not anger, but a cold dismissal. It stung quietly, A small thing at first, but it kept coming until the weight of it became unbearable. I began to notice that she no longer sought my advice. When I offered thoughts on matters at home, she would smile politely, then walk away without hearing me out. I thought perhaps she was busy or stressed, but over time it became clear this was not a matter of busyness. It was a matter of choice. She chose to ignore me. She treated my words as unnecessary, as if they were the ramblings of an old man whose time had passed. This change came slowly, but it grew steadily. She began to talk over me in conversations with neighbors and friends. She began to make decisions without consulting me, even about things that I thought belonged to our shared life. I remember feeling hurt, not because I wanted control, but because respect was slipping away. Respect, I realized, is not something given freely. It must be nurtured, and she had stopped nurturing it. I saw her begin to mock my age quietly, not in loud words, but in subtle ways that cut deeper than any open insult. She would laugh softly when I spoke of the past, as if my stories were irrelevant. She would shake her head gently at my advice, and the expression in her eyes said that she no longer valued my presence. It was a slow erosion of dignity, a quiet dismissal that left no loud noise but filled the air with bitterness. Her impatience became more obvious over time. When I asked her simple things, she would sigh deeply and answer curtly. She no longer asked how I was or if I needed anything. My presence in her home became something she tolerated rather than welcomed. She spoke as if I was a burden. Her words carried a quiet contempt that I could no longer ignore. The home I had built for her was now a place where my voice was unwelcome. At first, I endured silently, telling myself patience would win her back. I told myself that she was busy, that life was changing, and that one day she would remember who I was and what I had given her. I remembered my own father's patience with me, and I thought I could offer the same. I thought that time would heal this coldness, that my years of devotion would remind her of her duty to honor me. But the silence only grew heavier. I realized that her behavior was not a matter of circumstance, but a choice. She chose to treat me differently. She chose to take my presence for granted. The laughter of neighbors became louder when she spoke of me. I heard them whispering about the old man who does nothing. I heard the change in their tone as they spoke of me behind my back. I began to feel invisible in my own home. It was not just the way she spoke to me. It was the way she looked at me. I noticed her avoiding eye contact when I entered a room. Her gaze would shift quickly away, as if she did not want to meet mine. It was a small thing, but it carried a weight of rejection. Respect is not just words. It is in the eyes, in the way one meets another. And her eyes no longer carried respect for me. I remember one afternoon clearly. I had asked her about a small repair in the kitchen, something I thought needed attention. She looked at me, sighed deeply, and said with a sharp tone, "Why do you care? You don't live here." Those words struck me harder than any slap could. I had built that home. Every nail, every brick was part of my life. And she spoke to me as though I was a stranger. The neighbors began to notice it too. I could hear whispers when she spoke to them, subtle comments about the old man who is always in the way and how he does nothing now. I was present, but unseen. I was a father who had given everything, reduced to a shadow in my daughter's home. It was a quiet cruelty that grew louder with each passing day. She no longer acknowledged my presence at the table. Meals that once were shared became moments where I sat in silence. Her laughter, which I once cherished, became a sound I no longer recognized. She laughed not with me, but at me. And it was not kindness in her laughter, but mockery. I felt the walls I had built with care closing in on me, turning the home into a place of rejection. I endured in silence for many months, telling myself that patience would bring respect back. But patience was not enough. Silence was not enough. I realized she was teaching herself to disrespect me. The longer I endured quietly, the more she took my presence as weakness. She began to speak louder over me, ignoring my words, making decisions without me, treating me as if I had no voice. I began to see clearly that respect must be protected, and she was taking it away. I thought back to my own youth and the fathers who had taught me respect by example. Respect was not something that could be demanded in anger. It was something earned by living with honor. I had given her honor all my life, but she had stopped recognizing it. I realized that the silence I offered her had been mistaken for permission to dismiss me. I understood that if respect was to be restored, it could not come without action. I began to watch her carefully, to notice the small ways she showed disregard for me. She stopped inviting me to family gatherings. She began to speak to me only when necessary. She moved her chair at the table so I would be out of sight. I was still her father, but I was no longer part of her life in the way I had been. My presence was tolerated, not welcomed. My years of devotion had become invisible. The more I endured, the more her disregard grew. It was not a sudden cruelty, but a slow erosion, a quiet dismissal that cut deeper than words. She had stopped seeing me as her father and began seeing me as a burden. The respect I had built over decades was slipping away, replaced by impatience and mockery. I realized then that this was not about a single moment. It was about a pattern of behavior that had been allowed to grow unchecked. Her tone became sharper in family conversations. She would interrupt me, speak over me, and ignore my advice. Even my concerns about the house, which I had built with my own hands, were brushed aside. She spoke as if my experience was irrelevant, as if my life and my labor meant nothing. The silence I had kept became my answer, but I realized silence was not enough to stop the disrespect. There were times when I wanted to speak, to remind her of the years I had given her, the sacrifices I had made, but I held back, hoping she would remember on her own. I believed love would win respect. I believed that what I had done for her would speak louder than her words. But I was wrong. Respect, I learned, is not given freely. It is maintained through acknowledgement and care, and she had stopped caring. The signs of disrespect became undeniable. They were in the way she spoke to me, in the way she avoided me, in the laughter of the neighbors who had once respected our family. The home I had built, the life I had given, had become a place where I was mocked and ignored. I began to understand that what I faced was not just impatience or carelessness, but a deeper rejection, a loss of respect that could not be repaired by silence alone. I had given her my life, but she had chosen to give me disrespect in return. That realization was heavier than any insult or slap could be. It was not just my dignity that was at stake, but the meaning of everything I had built. I understood then that I could no longer stand quietly in the face of her disregard. Respect, once lost, must be reclaimed, and I knew I would reclaim mine. That quiet, slow erosion of respect was the turning point. It was the moment I realized that endurance alone would not save the bond I had hoped for. Silence was not enough. If I was to protect my dignity, I had to act. The signs of disrespect were no longer small moments. They were a pattern of behavior that demanded a response, and I was ready to give it. The cruelty did not arrive as a sudden storm, but as a slow, inevitable wave that had been building for months. The signs were already there, the avoidance, the impatience, the quiet disrespect, but nothing prepared me for the moment she crossed the line completely. It happened one afternoon, and even now, years later, the memory of it remains as sharp as the moment it occurred. It was not just an insult. It was a public act of humiliation, deliberate and crushing. The day began like any other. I had been doing small chores around her home, tending to things I had done countless times before without complaint. I fixed a leaky tap in the kitchen. I adjusted a loose hinge on a cabinet door. These were things I did quietly, without complaint, because I believed it was part of being a father, part of caring for a home that had been built with love. I did not expect gratitude, but I did expect respect. That expectation was about to be shattered. Later that afternoon, a disagreement arose. It was not about something large or important, a simple matter of whether to rearrange some furniture in the living room. I offered my opinion, speaking calmly, as I always did. But she responded with impatience, a coldness in her voice that I had learned to recognize. She brushed my words aside and moved the discussion toward her own way of seeing things. I tried again, gently, to explain why I thought my way made sense, but she interrupted me sharply. Her voice grew louder, her tone harsher. I could sense the rising tension in the air. What began as a simple disagreement turned into something far worse. The words she chose were not just dismissive, they were cutting. Her voice carried not just impatience, but contempt. The neighbors, who were outside in their gardens or walking by, began to notice. They stopped to look. What happened next was the moment I will never forget. Without warning, she stepped toward me and slapped me. Not a light touch, not an accidental gesture. It was deliberate, sharp, and intended to wound. The sound of her hand striking my cheek echoed in the room. It was not just the physical sting that hurt me, it was the humiliation of it, done in front of neighbors who now stopped to watch, some whispering, some shaking their heads in shock. I stood there frozen, the taste of disbelief heavy in my mouth. Her slap was not just an act of anger, it was an act of rejection. It was a statement that I, her father, the man who had given her everything, was nothing in her eyes. There was laughter after it, not quiet laughter, but cruel laughter, the kind that comes when someone feels victorious over another. I felt every eye turn toward me, some in shock, some in silent agreement with her cruelty. I became aware of the neighbors watching, whispering among themselves, their voices carrying the sound of gossip that would follow me forever. I could feel my face burning, not just from the slap, but from the shame. The humiliation was worse because it was public. A father, struck by his daughter in his own home, in front of neighbors, was a story that would spread quickly. The humiliation was compounded by the laughter and the whispers, the way her face carried satisfaction rather than regret. She wanted me to feel small, and she succeeded. The room was filled with tension after the act. I did not speak. I did not move. I simply stood there, the sound of her laughter still ringing in my ears. She looked at me as if daring me to say something, to retaliate. But I stayed silent, not because I was weak, but because I was processing. My mind was racing, going over years of sacrifice, of work done quietly and without complaint for her sake. Every moment of effort I had made felt reduced to nothing by her slap. The neighbors who were still nearby shifted uncomfortably. Some averted their eyes, others whispered louder. There was a murmur that traveled through the small crowd, a mixture of shock, pity, and disbelief. I could hear fragments of their conversation, words like disrespect, shame, and father mixed together. I knew this moment would not fade quickly. It would be told again and again, becoming a part of my life story in a way that no other moment had before. The slap was followed by silence, a silence heavier than any argument could produce. It was the sound of broken trust. It was the sound of a bond that had been torn apart. I stood there in that silence, the air thick with tension, knowing that something irreversible had happened. She had crossed a line that no father should be forced to endure. It was not just an insult to me. It was an insult to everything I had stood for. I thought about what I had done for her over the years. Every sleepless night I had spent working, every sacrifice I had made, every moment of my own comfort given away for hers. And here she was, turning her hand against me, striking me not in private, but in public, where the humiliation would be felt most deeply. It was a cruelty born of disregard, of a loss of respect so complete that she no longer saw me as her father, but as something to be mocked. I remember the way her face looked in that moment, not angry, but triumphant. She wanted me to feel small. She wanted to show the neighbors that she had power over me. The slap was not an act of passion in the heat of an argument. It was a calculated act of humiliation. That realization was harder to bear than the pain of her hand. It was the understanding that her words, her laughter, and her action had all been designed to break me. The humiliation followed me long after that day. I felt it in every glance of the neighbors, in every whisper I overheard. My own home, the place I had built and cared for, had become a place of disgrace. I began to see her differently, not as my daughter, but as someone who had turned away from all I had given her. That slap was the breaking point. It was the moment I knew silence would no longer be enough. That night, I sat alone in my room, the sound of her laughter still echoing in my mind. I replayed the moment over and over, each time feeling the sting of humiliation as fresh as the first time. I thought about my life, my sacrifices, and the years I had given her, and I thought about what I could do now. I knew that if I stayed silent, the disrespect would continue. I knew I could not let her treat me this way without consequence. I began to realize that this was no longer just a personal insult. It was an attack on my dignity, my identity as a father, and my place in the family. It was a wound deeper than the flesh, one that would not heal with time alone. The cruelty was not in the slap alone, but in the way it was delivered, in public, with laughter, with no regret. That was the moment I decided that action was necessary. The slap had stripped away the last layer of patience I had held on to. I could no longer hope that respect would return through quiet endurance. The lesson had been given to me in the most painful way possible. Silence alone would not protect my dignity. If I wanted to reclaim my honor, I would have to act. And I knew that action would not be loud or angry, but quiet, deliberate, and powerful. That cruel act became the turning point. It was no longer about forgiveness or patience. It was about justice and reclaiming what had been taken from me. I understood then that her slap was not just a moment of anger. It was a statement, and statements can only be answered with action of equal weight. I began to plan quietly, with the certainty that what I would do next would speak louder than any words I could ever say. That night, after the cruel slap, I did not sleep. I sat alone in my small room, leaning against the cold wall, my cheeks still aching from the blow, and my heart heavy with pain that went far deeper than flesh. The house was quiet, the kind of quiet that comes after a storm, when everything seems still yet charged with tension. Outside, I could hear faint noises of neighbors moving about, their voices low, as though even they felt the weight of what had happened earlier. I began to think about all the years I had lived, the years I had dedicated to my daughter, the years I had spent building a home for her comfort, for her future. I thought of the sacrifices I had made, silently, without asking for thanks, because a father's love does not measure kindness by rewards. I remembered the nights I had gone to bed hungry so she could have her fill, the times I had worked extra hours to pay for her schooling, the moments when I had set aside my own needs to give her everything she wanted. Those memories came flooding back that night, each one sharper and heavier than the last. I remembered her childhood, how I held her hand through storms, how I watched her grow, how I quietly carried her burdens when she could not. I remembered the day she moved into her own home, the pride I had felt, and the silent hope in my heart that she would honor the sacrifices I had made for her. I thought about the family dinners, the holidays, the moments we shared, and how they now seemed overshadowed by the cruel slap she had given me. The slap was not just a physical wound, it was a wound to my dignity. It was a statement that everything I had done for her was worthless in her eyes. That thought burned in me like fire. I could not sleep because my mind kept replaying the moment. The sound of her hand against my cheek, the laughter that followed, the way the neighbors had stopped to watch. It all became a heavy weight pressing down on my chest. I remembered sitting quietly at the dinner table earlier that week, listening to her speak with impatience, watching her dismiss my words as if they were not worth hearing. I remembered the change in her tone over the months, the way she no longer asked my advice, the way she ignored my presence. At first, I thought it was a phase. I thought love and patience would bring her back to respect me. But that slap was the proof that patience alone was no longer enough. In that quiet room that night, I began to reflect deeply on what respect really meant. Respect is not given because someone has the right to it. Respect is earned through actions, and it is maintained through mutual regard. I realized that my daughter's action was not just disrespectful, it was a declaration that she no longer saw me as a father worth honoring. That realization sank deep into my heart. I felt a mix of grief, disbelief, and anger, but above all, I felt the need to do something. I thought about how silence had been my answer for too long. For years, I endured small signs of disrespect, believing they would pass. I thought endurance was a sign of strength, but that night, I understood something different. Endurance without action can be weakness. I had endured her impatience, her dismissive words, her cold attitude, but this was something new. This was public humiliation, and humiliation demands a response. I began to replay the moment in my mind again and again, not in anger, but in calculation. I thought about the look on her face when she struck me, the laughter of the neighbors, the way the atmosphere in the house changed after that moment. I thought about what it meant for me as a father and what it meant for my dignity. I could no longer pretend that nothing had happened. Something had to change. I sat for hours that night, in the silence, reflecting not just on the slap, but on the years that led to it. I thought about every act of kindness I had shown her, every sacrifice I had made, and how they now seemed to mean nothing to her. I thought about the relationship between a father and a daughter, about trust, honor, and love, and about how fragile those things can become when respect is lost. In my reflection, I began to see clearly that this was no longer just about her. It was about me, my dignity, my life, my peace. I realized that if I remained silent, if I forgave without consequence, I would lose more than just respect. I would lose myself. I had to find a way to restore my dignity, not just for myself, but as a lesson to her. That night became a turning point, a moment of quiet but deep resolve. I thought about the kind of father I wanted to be remembered as. Not a man who endured humiliation quietly without standing for himself, but a man who knew when to act, who knew when to take a step that would protect his dignity and honor. I thought about the lessons I wanted her to learn, not through argument or anger, but through the quiet certainty of action. That night, I made a decision, not in haste, not in rage, but in quiet clarity. I decided that silence would no longer be my answer. I would find a way to respond that was deliberate, that carried the weight of years of sacrifice and the pain of that cruel slap. I would not respond with shouting or retaliation, but with an act that spoke louder than words, an act of quiet but undeniable justice. As I sat in the dark, my thoughts grew more focused. I considered my options. I could confront her directly, but that would only lead to more noise, more shouting, more hurt. I wanted something cleaner, something final. I wanted a response that could not be undone. I wanted to reclaim my dignity, not just in my own eyes, but in hers and in the eyes of those who had witnessed her cruelty. I thought about the home she lived in, about how I had helped build it, and about how it had become the stage for her humiliation of me. I realized that my answer had to involve that home. It was a symbol of the years I had given her, the life I had tried to build for her. If she could treat me that way in that place, then that place could also be the stage for her lesson. The thought came to me slowly, quietly, almost like a whisper in the night. It was not born of revenge in the way people imagine. It was born of the need for justice, the need to restore dignity. I began to plan quietly, in the silence of that long night, knowing that whatever I chose would change everything. I knew I could not undo the slap, but I could ensure that her actions had consequences that would speak louder than any argument. By the time morning came, my decision was clear. I would act, but my action would be quiet. It would be deliberate. It would not be about anger, but about reclaiming what she had taken from me, my dignity, my peace, and my place as her father. The slap had broken something between us, and I knew that there was no going back. My silence had ended, and my reflection had led me to a resolution that I would carry out without hesitation. That night of silent reflection became the foundation of what was to come. It was the moment when pain became purpose, when humiliation became resolve. I knew that whatever I did next had to be done with care, with clarity, and with certainty. And so, I prepared myself for the path ahead, knowing that my action would not just be a response to her cruelty, but a statement of my own worth, my own dignity, and my own quiet justice. The morning after that long night of reflection, I woke up with a quiet resolve. I felt no rage, but a calm certainty. The slap had been an act I could not ignore, and I knew that whatever I decided next would define not just that moment, but the rest of my life. It was not just about me. It was about what dignity meant, what justice meant, and what it meant to stand for oneself even when the ones you love most treat you with cruelty. I sat in my small kitchen, the sunlight spilling weakly through the window. I did not speak to anyone. I did not want to explain myself. I poured a cup of tea, feeling the warmth in my hand, thinking about what lay ahead. I knew the decision I would take was not simple. It would require thought, planning, and patience. But my mind was clear. I had to act. I had to make a choice that would end the humiliation, restore my dignity, and give her the lesson her cruelty deserved. For years, I had lived in quiet sacrifice. I had built her life, given her comfort, and endured neglect in silence. I had thought patience would win her respect again, but that slap proved it would not. Patience without action had not changed her. It had only allowed her disrespect to grow. That realization had crystallized during my silent reflection. If I wanted respect, I had to show her the price of cruelty. I began that morning by thinking of all the ways I could respond. I could confront her directly, demand an apology, argue my case before others. But I knew that would be noise, and noise would not change anything. Words could be forgotten, arguments could fade, but an action, deliberate, irreversible, and just, would leave a mark that could not be erased. That action would have to be quiet, done without drama, but powerful enough to speak louder than any words. My mind turned to her house. It had been built with years of my labor. Every brick, every nail, every corner of that home was a product of my sweat and sacrifice. And now, it had become the place where she humiliated me. It was there she had slapped me, in front of neighbors who watched and laughed. The house had become the stage of my disgrace. If there was to be an answer, it had to involve that house. It had to be a message she could not ignore. I remembered my father telling me once, "When you face cruelty, do not meet it with noise. Meet it with action." That memory came to me clearly that morning. I understood then that my action would not be loud or vindictive in the way people often think revenge to be. My action would be silent, deliberate, legal, and irreversible. It would be a lesson written not in words, but in consequence. I began to plan quietly. I did not speak to my daughter. I did not tell anyone. This was a matter of private resolve. I wanted it to be my decision alone, untouched by advice or opinion. I started by reviewing the documents of her property, quietly, methodically. I sat at my desk, papers spread before me, looking at ownership records, legal agreements, and past transactions. My years of hard work had given me more than a home for her. They had given me legal rights I had never thought I would use. Reading through the documents, I realized that I still had a claim over her property. It was not something I had ever imagined I would act upon, but now the idea became more than a possibility. It became a responsibility to myself. That house was not just a building. It was the symbol of everything I had given her, and in her slap, she had taken my respect. I decided that in return, I would take back something. The decision did not come in a rush. I spent days thinking about it. I considered the consequences, legal, personal, emotional. I knew it would change our relationship forever. I knew it would cause pain, perhaps anger. But I also knew that my silence was gone. I would no longer accept humiliation without consequence. I had to act, and that action would have to be final. I began speaking quietly to myself about what I would do. I told myself that this was not about revenge in the petty sense. It was about justice. It was about dignity. It was about teaching her that respect cannot be destroyed without cost. The slap had been an act of violence, not just to my body, but to my dignity as a father. My decision had to address that wound fully. I thought about how I could make the act irreversible. Words fade, apologies can be forgotten, but certain actions leave no room for reversal. Selling her house became the answer in my mind. The house was hers, legally, but I had the right to act through a clause I had discovered. It would be a quiet act, done without announcement, without confrontation, without drama, but final. That was the kind of answer I wanted. The process would take time. I knew it would not be simple. I would have to consult a lawyer quietly, arrange matters so there could be no contest. I would need to keep it secret until it was done. I knew secrecy was important because the moment I spoke of it, it could give her time to react or to undo it. My action had to be swift and absolute. I thought deeply about how this would change my life. I knew selling her house meant cutting a bond, severing a connection. But I was prepared for that. The slap had already severed something between us. What I would do now was a formal closing of that chapter. It was not just about property. It was about reclaiming my peace and dignity. Every day in the following weeks, my mind returned to that decision. I thought about the slap again and again, not with bitterness, but with clarity. I saw it as the point of no return. It was the moment that changed everything. I understood that I could no longer live with the humiliation. My decision was not born of anger, but of self-respect. I had endured enough. I contacted my lawyer quietly. I spoke in low tones, without haste. I explained what I wanted, and he assured me it was possible. That quiet assurance gave me more resolve. I felt a calm certainty that what I was about to do was right, not in the eyes of the world, but in the eyes of my own conscience. I began preparing quietly for the sale. I did not tell my daughter. I did not speak to anyone else. I moved carefully, making sure every step was correct, every document in place. It was not haste that drove me, but deliberation. I wanted this act to be clean, legal, and absolute. I wanted it to stand as a silent but unshakable answer to her cruelty. The days turned into weeks. I continued with my life quietly, but my mind was always on the decision. I knew that once done, there would be no turning back. That was the nature of this choice. I understood that this was more than a matter of property. It was a matter of reclaiming myself, my dignity, and my place as a father who would not be silenced by humiliation. By the time the process was complete, my mind was steady. I knew I had made the right choice. It was not a choice born of anger, but of necessity. I had thought deeply, reflected on what had happened, and chosen a path that would end the humiliation without noise. I had decided to speak through action rather than words. That decision gave me peace. Not the peace of forgetting, but the peace of knowing I had stood for myself in a way that could not be undone. I had decided to act quietly, deliberately, and without drama, and that would be my answer. My dignity would no longer be in question. I had chosen a path that was mine alone. That morning of decision became a turning point. It was the moment when silence ended and resolve began. I knew the days ahead would be difficult, but I was ready. I was ready to act with quiet certainty, to let the consequences speak louder than anything I could say. I was ready to reclaim what had been taken from me in that cruel moment. The decision was made. Now it was time to act. I knew this step was the most delicate part of my plan. The sale had to be done quietly, without her knowledge, without drama, and without room for reversal. I had thought about this for weeks. I had spoken with my lawyer in whispers. Every detail had been planned carefully. There could be no mistakes. Early one morning, before the world had fully woken, I sat in my study with my cup of tea. The documents lay before me. I went through them one more time, reading every line, every clause, ensuring there was no error. The house was hers, but the conditions of ownership gave me a legal pathway. This was not a matter of force. It was a matter of rightful action, backed by law. That was what gave me strength. I called my lawyer and instructed him to find a buyer who would act quickly and without fuss. I wanted the process to be invisible to her until it was complete. The buyer had to be discreet. The sale had to be clean. I wanted no gossip before the truth was revealed. This was not just a transaction. It was my quiet answer to years of disrespect. The lawyer worked quietly. I kept my daily life as normal as possible, so there would be no suspicion. I went about my mornings tending the garden, sipping tea, and walking quietly through the house I had built for her. It felt strange knowing I was about to let it go. But I knew the house was no longer just bricks and mortar. It was a symbol of the cruelty I had endured. Selling it was my act of closure. Finding a buyer was not easy, but my lawyer assured me it was possible. He had contacts who valued discretion. After a week of searching, we found the right person, someone willing to act quickly, without publicity, and with all legal guarantees in place. That was the moment I knew the plan would move forward without disruption. I signed the necessary papers in my lawyer's office. My signature was calm, steady. There was no trembling in my hand, no hesitation in my heart. This was the culmination of my decision. I was not acting out of anger anymore. I was acting out of resolve. I was reclaiming my dignity in the only way that mattered now. The documents were signed in secrecy. No one in the family knew. The transaction was complete before my daughter even realized it was happening. That secrecy was important to me. I wanted her to discover it in the moment of revelation, not in whispers or warnings. My act had to speak with certainty, not with noise. I thought about what she would feel when she found out. I thought about her laughter the day she slapped me and the humiliation I had endured in front of neighbors. That sound of laughter would now be replaced by the silence of realization. My sale would not be loud, but it would be final. That was the power of this action. There were moments during the process when doubt crept in. Was I being too harsh? Was there another way to find closure? But every time, the memory of her hand on my face, the look of ridicule, the whispering of neighbors reminded me why I had chosen this path. Silence would no longer be my answer. Action was the only answer left. I made sure every part of the sale was airtight. No legal loopholes, no technical errors. The documents were prepared so that she could not challenge them. This was not revenge in a petty sense. It was quiet justice, sealed in legality. I wanted the answer to be absolute. The sale was final. The house, once mine and hers in shared life, now belonged to someone else. I knew she would be shocked. I knew she would search for answers. But I was ready for that. I had no need to explain myself. The act would speak louder than any words. That evening, I walked through the quiet streets, thinking about what I had done. I felt no anger, only a strange peace. This was not about taking something from her. This was about reclaiming myself. Every step I took felt like a step away from humiliation and toward dignity. I thought about the moment when she would discover the truth. I imagined her walking through that empty house, the rooms she had taken for granted now belonging to a stranger. I imagined the silence, the disbelief, the absence of laughter. That thought gave me strength. The next days passed quietly. I kept my routine, tending to my small garden and my daily walks. But in my mind, the sale was complete, and so was my decision. I had acted. I had answered cruelty with certainty. I had chosen peace over noise, dignity over argument. Selling her house was not just about justice. It was about closure. It was about drawing a line in my life and moving forward. I knew the consequences. I knew the fracture it would cause. But I was certain that this was the only way to restore my peace. The act of sale became a quiet ritual for me. Each signature, each document filed, each conversation with my lawyer was a step in that ritual. It was not done in haste. It was done with deliberation and care. I wanted it to be perfect. I wanted it to stand as a silent but unshakable answer to her disrespect. When the final paperwork was complete, I felt a calm that I had not felt in years. The decision I had made, the action I had taken, was mine alone. It was not about winning or losing. It was about dignity. And that dignity had been reclaimed. In those days after the sale, I thought about the years I had spent building her life, about the sacrifices I had made. I thought about the laughter, the arguments, the silence, and the slap. And I understood that this act of sale was the answer to all of it. It was my way of saying that dignity matters, and it can never be taken without consequence. I did not announce the sale. I let it remain my quiet secret until the moment of revelation. That was how I wanted it to be. Not a spectacle, but a closing statement. A lesson wrapped in silence and certainty. The day came when I knew the sale was complete. It was not marked by noise or confrontation. It was marked by a quiet knowing. I had acted. I had done what I had decided was right. I had closed the chapter. That evening, I sat alone with my thoughts. I did not celebrate. I did not gloat. I simply felt peace. It was not the peace of forgetting, but the peace of resolution. I had acted, and that act was final. That sale was more than property exchanged. It was a statement. A quiet, powerful, irreversible statement that cruelty carries a price. I had paid mine, and she had paid hers. I knew there would be fallout. I knew she would discover it soon. But I was ready. I had acted quietly, legally, and with purpose. There was no turning back. The sale was complete. My decision was made, and my dignity was reclaimed. The day of revelation came quietly, without fanfare. I had planned this moment carefully. There was no rush, no need to make it dramatic. The act of revelation itself was to be silent but certain, a moment that would speak louder than arguments or tears. I wanted her to feel the weight of what had been done without me needing to shout or explain. That was the point. I waited until mid-afternoon. The sun was soft that day, casting long shadows across the street. The neighbors were there, as usual, moving about in their lives. They did not know what was about to happen. I wanted it to be private for me, but public enough for her humiliation to be complete. She had chosen public cruelty. This too would be witnessed. I walked to her house quietly, carrying the bundle of papers with me. They were sealed, legal, irreversible. I kept them in my coat pocket, folded neatly, not as a threat, but as proof of what had already been done. I had no intention of arguing or explaining. The truth was already written and signed. When I reached her doorstep, I hesitated. I felt the same quiet calm I had felt when signing the sale. This was not about rage. This was about closure. I knocked softly, and she answered in surprise. I could see the curiosity in her eyes. She did not expect me, and certainly not this. I stepped in quietly, without a word. I placed the papers on the table. Her eyes followed every movement. I did not speak immediately. I let the silence stretch. The neighbors outside would soon notice something was different. That silence was part of my answer. Finally, I said calmly, "Your house is sold." My voice was steady, without anger, without emotion. It was a statement, not a question. Her eyes widened. She stared at me, then at the papers. Her hands trembled. There was no sound but the rustle of the papers under my coat. She looked at me, searching for something, maybe an explanation, maybe a reason. But I gave her none. Silence was my answer. My quiet, certain revenge. She tried to speak, but the words did not come. The papers lay between us like a barrier, complete and final. The neighbors gathered outside. Their whispers began quietly, then louder. They had seen me enter. They knew something had happened. Her voice trembled now. She asked what this meant, but I did not reply. I let the papers speak. Every clause, every signature was a silent testament to what had been done. I could see her face change. First confusion, then disbelief, then a quiet panic. She turned to the papers again and again, as if looking for some error, some loophole. There was none. The sale was complete. I had made sure of that. Neighbors began to whisper louder now. Some came closer to the door to see. They had heard the slap days ago, had watched the way she treated me, and now they saw the result. This was not an argument anymore. This was the consequence of her cruelty, displayed quietly but powerfully. I stayed calm. I did not need to speak. My calmness was my answer to her shouting, to her slap, to her humiliation of me in front of them before. I knew she would try to argue. I knew she would try to make noise. But this was not the time for noise. This was the time for finality. She looked at the papers once more, her hands shaking. Her face was pale. I could see the realization dawning on her. I could see the understanding that this was not something she could take back. She had lost not just a house, but a place that represented her comfort, her security, her pride. I stepped back quietly. I did not need to add words. Her silence was answer enough. The neighbors outside now whispered openly. Some looked at me with quiet approval, others with curiosity. But all understood the moment was complete. I turned to leave. Her voice called me, shaky and uncertain. She asked for a reason. I paused at the door. I did not answer. I let the silence answer her. I walked away calmly, leaving her standing there with the papers. Her voice faded behind me. The sound of the neighbors talking grew as I walked away. I did not look back. That was my choice. The revelation was hers to live with, and mine was to walk away with dignity restored. I had given her no explanation because the act itself was my explanation. As I walked down the street, I could hear fragments of their voices. Words like justice, final, and quiet revenge reached me. They did not matter. What mattered was that I had acted. I had taken my pain and turned it into a final decision that gave me peace. The papers now lay on her table. They were not just documents. They were a statement of truth, of law, of quiet, but absolute justice. They told the story of years of sacrifice, of disrespect, and of a final, silent answer. She would remember this day. She would remember the quietness of it, the calmness in my voice, the certainty in my step as I walked away. That would be her lesson. That was my intention. To let her understand, without me saying another word, the cost of cruelty. For me, the revelation was not about victory. It was about closure. It was about knowing that the path I had chosen was the one that restored my dignity. She had given me humiliation. I had given her a truth that could not be undone. As I turned the corner and walked away from her house for the last time, I felt an unusual lightness. Not the lightness of forgetting, but the lightness of a chapter closed. I knew she would talk about it. The neighbors would talk about it. But I no longer cared for their words. I had my peace. This was my answer, my quiet, final, and complete answer. The house was gone, the humiliation was answered, and I was free. The revelation was complete. The fallout began quietly, but its impact spread fast. That afternoon, after I had left her house for the last time, the whispers began. They started with the neighbors who had seen me enter and leave, the papers still on the table, her stunned face framed by disbelief. What happened between us was no longer private. It had become the subject of conversation for the entire street, and soon the entire neighborhood. I did not go back to see what happened. I walked away because the fallout was not mine to control. It was hers. Her decision to slap me had set the stage, and my quiet revelation had sealed the outcome. From that day, she lived with the knowledge that her cruelty had led to her ruin. She was left with no house, no security, and no easy way to undo what had been done. Within hours, neighbors began talking openly about it. Some approached her cautiously, offering sympathy that was mixed with curiosity. Others whispered among themselves about justice and consequence. I heard later that her friends and relatives were split, some blaming her, others quietly questioning whether she had brought this upon herself. But the truth was clear. She could not deny the outcome. In the days that followed, I heard through quiet channels about what happened inside her home. She had called her lawyer in desperation, hoping to find a loophole, a way to reverse the sale. But there was none. Every document was signed, every clause in place. The sale was absolute and final. This was not a case of revenge that could be undone with words or pleas. This was final. Her pride suffered most. She was not used to losing control, especially in a way that was silent and decisive. Her humiliation deepened as she realized she could not undo what I had done. Her neighbors, once laughing at her confidence, now looked at her differently. Whispers followed her wherever she went. The story of her cruelty and my quiet justice spread quietly but firmly. She tried to speak to me afterward. I heard she had come to my temporary address, asking for answers, pleading for her home back. But I did not respond. I had made my choice. I had done what I came to do. Her appeals were just noise to me now. I wanted no part of further confrontation. My decision was done. The fallout extended beyond her pride. Her relationships began to shift. Friends distanced themselves, unsure how to stand beside someone who had treated her own father so cruelly. Relatives took sides quietly. Some sided with her, others with me. The family gatherings she once hosted became quieter, strained with unspoken words. My absence was a presence of its own, a reminder of what had been lost. In the neighborhood, I became a subject of quiet respect. People began to talk about the dignity of my action, the way I had handled humiliation without shouting or fighting. They spoke of my calmness, of my quiet but complete answer. I learned later that my silence had become my loudest statement. It was not the slap, not even the sale, but the way I walked away that stayed with people. She, on the other hand, lived in quiet chaos. Without her house, she lost more than bricks and walls. She lost her sense of safety. Her pride was fractured. The laughter that once followed her cruelty turned into whispers of pity and warning. Neighbors began to treat her differently. Invitations stopped. People crossed the street to avoid gossip. The fallout of her choice had gone far beyond her expectations. There were moments when I wondered if she ever understood fully why I had acted. I wondered if she realized it was never just about the house. It was about respect, about dignity, about making sure her cruelty did not stand unanswered. The house had been a symbol, a gesture, a final statement that I would not accept being treated with such contempt. Months later, I learned she spoke of me quietly to others, sometimes in anger, sometimes in regret. But always, she mentioned the day I told her, "Your house is sold." That was the moment she could not forget. That was the moment when reality settled in, and she understood the gravity of her actions. Her humiliation remained. The whispers followed her wherever she went. The fallout was not loud. It did not need to be. It was a quiet unraveling. A life once taken for granted, now questioned by all who knew her. She could still live, but she could never recover her dignity the way she had stripped mine. That was the lesson, carried quietly through the neighborhood, through family whispers, and into the years ahead. For me, the fallout was different. I found peace in walking away. I knew I had answered her cruelty without losing myself to anger. I had preserved my dignity and taught a lesson that could not be erased. That was the quiet power of my choice. The fallout was hers to live with, mine to leave behind. The day she realized this fully, she stopped speaking of it publicly. The whispers grew softer, but I knew she carried that moment in her heart forever. The moment when a father, treated without respect, had given a quiet answer that was louder than any shout. And in the silence of my own life afterward, I carried no bitterness, only a quiet certainty that the fallout had proven the truth. Cruelty can be answered, dignity can be restored, and justice can be served without confrontation, without rage, with silence. That was my final gift to her and to myself. The escape began not with haste, but with a quiet decision. After the storm of that day, after the slap, after the sale, after the revelation, I knew there was nothing left for me to do in that place. My dignity had been restored, but my presence there was no longer mine to keep. Every corner of her home, every street I had walked for decades, carried the weight of what had happened. I could not remain where the memory of that moment lived so vividly. I began to prepare quietly. I sold what I could without fanfare, small belongings that carried comfort, yet were not worth the trouble of keeping. My savings were enough, carefully planned over years, because I had always known life could change in a moment. I found myself making lists, quietly, as if preparing for a long journey without telling anyone. No one needed to know. This was not an announcement. This was a personal departure. I contacted a travel agent discreetly, asking about quiet towns, places far away from gossip and old wounds. My mind settled on a small coastal town, where the sea would be enough to cleanse what had been bruised inside me. Somewhere I could rebuild my days without the weight of their eyes upon me. Somewhere peace was not a word, but a living reality. The night before my departure, I sat in silence. The house was quiet, except for the sound of the wind outside. I remembered years of labor, years of sacrifice. I remembered my daughter, my home, my life there. But I also remembered the slap, that moment that broke the chain of my belonging. It was a memory that would not fade, and I knew it was time to leave it behind. I packed slowly, carefully. Each item folded with thought, not haste. Clothes, a few books, some photographs, the barest essentials of life. I left nothing of value behind that would bind me to that place again. Every object taken was a step toward freedom. Every item left was a step away from the past. My suitcase became my vessel of escape. The morning I left, I stepped outside quietly before dawn. The streets were still, the world asleep. I locked the door behind me without looking back. I carried no anger, no regret, only the resolve of a man who had chosen his peace over conflict. I walked to the station, each step measured, calm, deliberate. On the train, I watched the scenery pass without thought. The fields, the rivers, the towns, all faded behind me. I did not speak to anyone. My escape was not loud. It was not a protest. It was a surrender to the need for a new beginning. I felt lighter with each mile. The burden of betrayal, of humiliation, of confrontation began to lift. When I arrived at my destination, I was greeted by the quiet beauty of the coastal town. Small streets, the scent of the sea, the sound of waves meeting the shore. It was the peace I had sought, wrapped in simplicity. I rented a small home, a place where no one knew my name or my story. I became a stranger to everyone, and in that, I found comfort. The days turned into weeks. I walked along the shore every morning, breathing in the salt air, letting the sound of the waves cleanse my spirit. I built a life of quiet routine, simple meals, small tasks, days filled with nothing but peace. My heart, once heavy with the weight of humiliation, now rested in calm. I had escaped not just the place, but the pain. In the town, I was free from whispers. No one knew the story of my daughter, the slap, the sale. I could walk without the weight of judgment or gossip. My escape was complete. The world I left behind remained locked in memory, and I carried it quietly in my heart, not as a wound, but as a lesson. I often thought of what I had left behind, my daughter, my home, the life I once knew. But I also thought of what I had gained, freedom, dignity, peace. My escape was not loss, it was a reclaiming of myself. I had traded a life of disrespect for one of quiet living. That was my victory. Over time, I became part of the town without being part of any one story. The people knew me as the quiet man by the sea. I never told them my full story. It was mine alone. My escape had taught me that some things are meant to be left behind. Pain, betrayal, humiliation. These were not burdens I would carry forever. Years passed. The coastal town became home. My days were filled with peace, and my nights with quiet reflection. I never regretted my decision to leave. I never regretted selling her house. I never regretted the escape that saved me. In leaving, I had found what I had sought all along: peace. Looking back now, I know that my escape was more than leaving a place. It was leaving behind the weight of disrespect and cruelty. It was stepping into a life where my dignity was my own. And in that, I found the greatest freedom of all. My escape was quiet, but it was complete, and I never came back. Now, as an old man, I tell this story quietly, not to boast, not to seek sympathy, but because the truth is a lesson I wish to share. I have lived long enough to understand what respect truly means and what dignity demands. I have learned that some wounds cannot be healed by words, but only by choices. My choice was escape. My choice was silence. My choice was peace. And I stand by it. Looking back, I realize my life has been shaped by decisions. Small ones, large ones, quiet ones, loud ones. Each step led me here, to this moment of reflection. I remember the years I gave to my daughter, every sacrifice without counting cost. I remember believing that respect would be the natural return for a lifetime of care. I remember the hope that family meant honor, love, and protection. And I remember her slap, that single moment that shattered all my expectations. That slap was not just a hand against my face, it was a statement. a wordless declaration of disregard. I felt more than the sting. I felt the collapse of trust, the breaking of a bond I had nurtured for decades. In that instant, I knew there was no repair without deep change. But change would not come from arguing. Change would not come from fighting. Change could only come from action, and action requires clarity of heart. I thought of all the times I had been silent, all the moments I had swallowed my pride for the sake of family. I had given without asking, sacrificed without complaint. But respect cannot be begged for. Respect cannot be demanded. Respect must be earned and returned. When that respect was denied so openly, I realized my voice was no longer enough. My presence was no longer enough. I needed something stronger, proof that dignity is a treasure worth guarding. That proof came not in confrontation, but in quiet action. I sought counsel from my lawyer, not with anger, but with resolve. I learned of my rights, of the power still in my hands, and I made a decision. A decision not born of revenge for its own sake, but of a deeper need for closure. I chose to sell her house. I chose to reclaim my life. I chose to walk away. Walking away was not easy. There were days of doubt, days when I wondered if I should have stayed, if I should have spoken louder, fought harder. But I realized that my dignity was not measured by the battle I could win, but by the peace I could find. Leaving became my answer. Leaving became my statement. Leaving became my freedom. Since that day, I have lived quietly. I have built a life without noise, without conflict. I have lived in a place where the only sound is the sea and the wind. I have found joy in small things, the color of the morning sky, the rhythm of waves, the kindness of strangers. My dignity lives in these simple moments, untouched by bitterness or regret. I reflect often on what I have learned. I have learned that cruelty leaves a mark deeper than the body can feel. I have learned that silence can be louder than words. I have learned that escape is not surrender, but a form of strength. And I have learned that dignity cannot be stolen. It can only be given away or taken by choice. My daughter's slap was a wound I could never erase, but it was also a lesson I could not forget. It taught me that family is not always a shelter and that respect is not guaranteed. It taught me that sometimes the greatest act of love is walking away. And it taught me that peace is not found in winning, but in choosing to let go. Now, as I sit in the quiet of my new home, I know I have found that peace. My days are mine again. My nights are mine again. My dignity is mine again. I have chosen a life without cruelty, without disrespect. I have chosen a life of calm, and that is why I tell my story today, not to relive the pain, but to share the lesson. Not to seek justice, but to show what true strength looks like. Respect must be earned, cruelty must be answered, and dignity must be guarded. My daughter slapped me in front of neighbors. I sold her house. I left the country. I never came back. That is my truth. That is my reflection. That is my peace.